We're the big one today.
We are, yeah. A name everyone's heard of, but a part of his life that maybe gets glossed over a bit.
Exactly. Confucius. Everyone knows the name, but we're zeroing in on, I guess you could call it, his political years.
Yeah. His time in the state of Lu trying to, well, be a politician. Yeah.
Not exactly the image that comes to mind when you think Confucius.
Yeah. Given all this, given the impending political struggles in Luva, could Confucius have possibly held on to his position? What challenges would he have faced, and how might his experiences, his interactions with Duke Ding, his own reflections on power and morality have shaped his actions?
But to really understand his philosophy, his impact, this period's crucial.
Absolutely. And that's what we're diving into today, specifically Confucius and this ruler, Duke Ding of Lu.
Not the most powerful guy, was he?
Nope, not by a long shot. The sources we've got paint a picture of Lu, kind of like a puppet state.
Puppet state. Okay, I like that. So who were the puppet masters pulling the strings?
These powerful clans, the three Huan families they're called, and a figure, Yang Hu, they basically ran the show.
So Duke Ding, while technically the ruler, had very limited authority. He was stuck dealing with these powerful nobles who were really calling the shots.
Right. And that's the backdrop for Confucius entering the scene. What's interesting is how Confucius acted in this environment.
From what I was reading, very improperly, like by the book.
Exactly. Our sources emphasize how meticulous he was in observing courtly etiquette, especially when interacting with Duke Ding. Complete contrast to the three Huan, who apparently didn't bother so much.
Oh, that's got a sting for the Duke. Seeing these upstart nobles disrespecting him, and then there's Confucius, all proper and deferential. It's like a silent commentary on who's got real class, you know?
You can see how that would appeal to a duke who's been sidelined by these powerful families. And there's another layer here. Remember Confucius's earlier attempt to weaken the three Huan, the demolition of the three capitals.
Right, that didn't go so well. But it shows that, at least at that point, Confucius and Duke Ding were on the same page. They both wanted to see the Duke's authority restored. So from Duke Ding's perspective, getting Confucius closer must seem like a good move.
Absolutely. But our sources emphasize the danger here for Duke Ding. Any open move towards Confucius, any hint of a political alliance could alert the three Huan and make his position even worse.
So they're stuck in this weird dance. Duke Ding wanting Confucius on his side, but having to play it cool, not make any sudden moves.
Exactly. And this brings us to their first recorded conversation, as seen in the Analects. On the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward question from Duke Ding. He asks something like, shouldn't a ruler command his ministers and ministers serve the ruler?
This is pretty basic, right?
It does. But Confucius's answer is crucial. He says, a ruler should employ his ministers under the guidance of rituals, and ministers should serve the ruler with the attitude of loyalty.
Okay, classic Confucius, right? Ritual and loyalty. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? Especially when you consider the power dynamics we've been talking about.
When he talks about rituals, he's not just referring to ceremonies. He's talking about the entire established order, the traditions that everyone, even the Duke, is bound by.
So it's like Confucius is gently reminding Duke Ding that he's not an absolute monarch. He can't just boss people around, especially not the three Huan. He has to operate within the existing system.
Exactly. And for our listeners, this is key to understanding Confucius's political philosophy. He's not advocating for blind obedience to a ruler. It's all about balance, about everyone fulfilling their roles within the established order.
And that order, at least in Lu, included some very powerful nobles that the Duke had to contend with.
Right. Now, the next conversation, the sources suggest it was probably more private, gets even more interesting. Duke Ding asks about a single sentence that could bring prosperity or collapse to a country.
Okay, now he's getting to the point, isn't he? It's like he's saying, Confucius, you're a smart guy. Tell me what to do to fix this mess.
It does sound that way, doesn't it? He's almost seeking a magic solution, that one perfect move to turn things around.
And how does Confucius respond?
Very carefully. He doesn't give Duke Ding a simple answer. Instead, he talks about the difficulty of being both a ruler and a minister. He says, if you can really understand the difficulties of being a ruler, then there is somewhat the meaning of a single sentence can bring about the prosperity of a country.
He's saying it's not about finding the right words. It's about understanding and empathy. That's a pretty nuanced answer for a guy who's supposed to be all about following rules, you know.
It is. And it's important to remember that Confucius wasn't against political power. He just believed it had to be exercised responsibly, ethically.
So no quick fix for Duke Ding.
No. And then Duke Ding takes it a step further, asking about a single sentence that could cause collapse.
Now this feels like a test. He wants to see where Confucius's loyalties lie.
Mm.
Is he with the Duke or with the three Huan?
It's a very loaded question, isn't it? And again, Confucius's answer is ambiguous. He warns against a ruler who issues unreasonable commands that are blindly followed. He says that that kind of single sentence could lead to ruin.
So on the surface, he's just giving generic advice. But given the context, it sounds like he's subtly warning Duke Ding against making any rash moves, like trying to get rid of the three Huan by force.
Exactly. He's saying, don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Violence won't solve anything.
Okay, so based on these conversations, it seems like Confucius, even though he sympathizes with Duke Ding's position, is not about to become his political attack dog.
Right. He's not looking to form an alliance against the three Huan. He seems to be aiming for a peaceful coexistence where everyone respects their roles within the existing hierarchy.
A delicate balancing act, to say the least.
Absolutely. Their interactions are subtle, but there's a definite undercurrent of danger, given the ever-present power of the three Huan.
So far, we've seen Confucius maneuvering through this political minefield. Now I'm curious, how did he feel about all this? About being an official, dealing with these powerful figures?
Well, the Analects does give us some glimpses into his mindset during this period. He reflects on what he's learned, what he's gained, and how he's managed to stay true to his principles while navigating the messy world of politics.
And, there's this surprisingly human element to it. He compares himself to some of his old friends who never achieved his level of success, who remained poor.
Right. It's a reminder that even Confucius, the sage, wasn't immune to a little bit of human pride, comparing himself to others. But the source is careful to point out that his criticism wasn't directed at everyone from humble beginnings.
It was about their motivation. It was about those who sought office purely for personal gain, who were in it for themselves and not for the good of the people. He calls them anxious for fear of loss.
A great phrase, isn't it? And so relevant even today. Think about how many people are driven by that fear, that sense of scarcity, instead of a genuine desire to serve.
He also seems to have had very little patience for those armchair scholars, the ones who complained about everything but couldn't actually get anything done.
Yeah, all talk and no action.
But what's interesting is how Confucius's views seem to change during this period. He becomes more pragmatic. The course talks about him embracing the idea of saving the country by a circuitous route, which suggests he's willing to compromise, to be flexible, to achieve his goals.
He's moving away from that idealistic black and white thinking.
And this leads him to believe that some of his old colleagues, the ones who clung to rigid principles, were politically naive.
Right. He's seeing the world in shades of gray now. And this brings us to a pretty major twist. Confucius, after 6 years in office, gets promoted to acting Grand Minister of Land.
Wait, what? The highest position in Luquan.
Yep. And according to Sima Qinan, he was 56 years old at this time.
But this doesn't make sense. Why would the three Huan, the very people he'd been trying to undermine, promote him to such a powerful position?
That's the big question, isn't it? The source suggests a few possibilities. Were they setting a trap, trying to control him from within? Were Confucius's own disciples worried about this? According to Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, they were. One even warned Confucius to be careful. But Confucius, it seems, was optimistic, believing he could use this opportunity to make a real difference.
This is where it gets really interesting and a bit controversial. This is when the story of Confucius executing Shao Zhengmao comes in.
Ah, yes, the supposed execution.
Sima Qian describes this Shao Zhengmao as a doctor of the state of Lu, someone who was disrupting the government. Sounds like a serious threat.
It does. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Our source makes a compelling argument that this entire event was likely a fabrication by later generations.
Hold on, you're saying the execution of Shao Zhengmao never happened?
That's the argument, and a strong one. Think about it. The Analects, the Book of Rites, both compiled by Confucius's disciples, they don't mention Shao Zhengmao at all. Not a word about this supposed execution.
If it was such a big deal, why wouldn't they include it? It's not like they were trying to hide Confucius's flaws. They're pretty honest about his mistakes.
Exactly. They even record instances where he was wrong or made poor decisions. So the absence of this supposedly major event is very telling.
Okay, so if it's not in the early sources, where does this story even come from?
The earliest mention we can find is in the Zunzi, a text from the late Warring States period, centuries after Confucius's death. And even there, it's not a straightforward account of a criminal being punished.
What is it then?
The Zunzi portrays Shao Zhengmao as more of an intellectual opponent. They say he held dangerous ideas, behaved strangely, spoke persuasively but with false words, and was gathering people, causing unrest.
So it's an ideological clash, battle of ideas.
Exactly. And it's important to note that this idea of a contention of 100 schools of thought, this clash of different philosophies, wasn't really a thing during Confucius's lifetime. It developed later.
Right, so this story might be projecting a later intellectual conflict back onto Confucius.
That's one possibility. And then later on, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, Wang Shang's Lunheng adds even more detail, claiming that Shao Zhengmao opposed Confucius in education and even tried to steal his students.
So it becomes this whole dramatic narrative. And over time, the Confucius executing Shao Zhengmao's story turns into a kind of historical justification for sages using force when necessary.
Right, but if you look at Confucius's other teachings, his emphasis on persuasion, on moral example, on leading by virtue, it just doesn't add up.
And our source points out that if Shao Zhengmao was such an influential figure, surely there'd be some record of his ideas, his followers, somewhere. But there's nothing.
Just this one account in the Zunzi. And even there, it's not a clear-cut case of a crime being punished. It's framed as an ideological struggle.
Plus, there's that story in the Analects, where someone asks Confucius about killing a deviant person to promote goodness, and Confucius basically says, no, you can't force people to be good, you have to lead by example. He uses that analogy of the wind and the grass.
A powerful image, right? The wind blowing, the grass bending. It's about influence, not coercion.
So putting it all together, the missing evidence, the later sources, the inconsistency with Confucius's other teachings, it seems pretty clear that this execution story is likely a fabrication.
That's the conclusion our source reaches, and it's a compelling one. They even suggest that Zunzi might have invented this story to justify suppressing his own philosophical opponents.
Which, if you think about it, is kind of ironic. They're using Confucius, the advocate for virtue and harmony, to justify silencing dissenting views.
It's a great example of how history can be manipulated to serve different agendas. And for our listeners, it's a reminder to always be critical of the stories we're told, to dig deeper, to look for alternative perspectives.
Absolutely. So, if this execution didn't happen, what was Confucius doing during his time as acting Grand Minister of Land? What do the sources say?
They point to him focusing on more practical matters, improving social morality, public order.
Like what kind of things specifically?
Apparently, market behavior improved in Quofu, and public conduct became more orderly. It sounds like he was focused on building a stronger ethical foundation within the state.
Makes sense. No big sweeping reforms like trying to demolish those capitals again.
No, seems like the focus shifted to more immediate concerns, probably maintaining stability and trying to navigate the complex political situation.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got Duke Ding stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to cautiously enlist Confucius's help. But Confucius, ever the pragmatist, isn't about to be anyone's pawn. He plays the game carefully, offering advice, but ultimately staying true to his own principles.
And then we've got this myth of the execution, which, when you really examine it, falls apart. It's a later fabrication, probably meant to serve someone else's agenda.
Really highlights how history can be distorted, how stories can be changed and reshaped to fit certain narratives.
Absolutely. So, final question for our listeners. Given all this, given the impending political struggles in Luva, could Confucius have possibly held on to his position? What challenges would he have faced, and how might his experiences, his interactions with Duke Ding, his own reflections on power and morality have shaped his actions? It's a reminder that even great figures like Confucius were constantly navigating complex situations, trying to balance their ideals with the realities of power.
Great food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.